My name is David Meltzer. I'm the Secretary General of GVF. GVF is the global trade association for the satellite industry, with members from all regions of the world representing the entire satellite ecosystem. And it's my pleasure to introduce each of our wonderful panelists on this discussion of satellites' disruptive evolution in orbit and on Earth. Starting to introduce Dave Reban. Dave is with Hughes. Dave is the Vice President for International Division. Next we have Simon Gray. Simon is the Senior Vice President of Civil Government at Eutelsat. We're also wonderfully joined by Imran Malik. He's the Vice President for Global Sales Fixed Data at SES. And finally, Mike DiPaolo, Director of Business Development at Spacebridge. Gentlemen, welcome. It's very fortunate that we have such an excellent group of people to talk about developments in the satellite industry, not just up in space, but also on the ground. And each of you come from major players in the satellite industry. And I want to give each of you an opportunity to talk about one really interesting innovation coming out of your company. So let me start with Mike. I guess we'll start with you, Mike. What's the one innovation that you're particularly excited about coming out of Spacebridge? Mike?
Well, first of all, I'm just want to say I've been with Spacebridge for 6 months, and I'm glad that I joined it at such an exciting time with so much innovation happening in the space segment space. That you know, it's great to be in a ground equipment market because there's so much evolution going on over there. So you know, we've been focusing on developing multi-gigabit type high-speed modems. We've been focusing on our basically evolving our TDMA solution to operate with HTS and very high throughput satellites. But I think the most interesting thing, the most single interesting innovation that we've been working on is really on rethinking how our TDMA solution should work in a network, which is going to be cloud-based and with only focusing on transmit and receive resources at gateways. It's a very interesting time on how we're spending a lot of time looking to divide our system into more manageable parts that could be managed across cloud environments or across data centers versus just a single solitary hub as we've traditionally viewed our solutions.
Really very interesting, the ways you're developing. I want to ask Simon, I mean, for Eutelsat, there's a lot new coming on the market. But I'm forcing you, Simon, to talk about one particular development, one innovation that you think is really potentially a game changer for Eutelsat. What do you want to highlight?
It's difficult to pick one that is really my favorite. I think our nanosats for IoT fleet would be very interesting and will be a very interesting introduction to our solutions. I also think that, and this is actually the one that I think will be the biggest impact, is that when we get to 2.0 of HTS, which is the VHTS, when we get to generation 2.0, and I think that will be the most impactful on our lives and certainly for Eutelsat, our bottom line. We've been operating an HTS over a continent for 9 years. We were the first operator to open a dedicated HTS over a whole continent. And I'm really looking forward to the challenge next year in 2022, when we start services. So that's my favorite, I think.
Thank you. So very high throughput satellites, obviously bringing a whole range of services to the market. Imran, let me give you the opportunity. Over at SES, obviously a lot of developments, not just in GEO, but MEO, new services, new products. What's the one area that SES views as perhaps the most innovative and exciting opportunity?
I think what I would like to do is just address this from the satellite industry's perspective. So, I mean, if you look at what's been going on in the industry for the last couple of years, so we've had quite a few challenges, and some would say there's lots and lots of disruption in the market. And like any disruption or challenge, we have opportunities, and obviously we have challenges. The opportunities are in terms of the volume growth, and which nobody can deny. And the challenge is the severe pressure on profitability. The EBITDA margins are under threat, and also there are lots of terrestrial innovations which can replace us. So for us, I mean, keeping in mind the volume growth as well as the pressure on the profitability, I think for us the biggest and the most recent innovation from SES is the O3b mPOWER constellation. So this is a medium Earth orbit constellation that builds on the O3b constellation, which has been in operation for the last 6 years. The most unique thing about this new particular constellation is that we are going to be able to provide terabits of capacity. It's an all-digital payload, which lets us do thousands of beams, and it provides unprecedented flexibility and power. And we believe that will open up a new era of satellite-based communications. We will be online in 2022.
Thank you, Imran. And so obviously the MEO orbit, Middle Earth Orbit medium, is an area that has already been exploited, will increasingly be exploited, and we'll be talking about the NGSO developments as well. I want to turn now to Dave and Hughes, and I think Hughes is in a very interesting position of having both ground and space innovations. So perhaps it's a little unfair, Dave, for me to force you to say which one. You're going to have to play a favorite. But Dave, from Hughes's perspective, what's the single most interesting innovation coming out of the shop these days?
So I have to kind of scratch my head because there's a long list of things. By the way, including, we're excited about working with both Eutelsat and SES right now. We have some pretty exciting programs with both of them. I think those are both innovative. We've brought some interesting technologies out recently, including adaptive coding and modulation on the TDMA return channels. But the one thing that I'm really excited about is in a slightly different aspect, and that is a focus area of ours is applying artificial intelligence and machine learning to network operations and network management. And so we've already implemented this in our North America managed service for enterprise business. We've seen increasing complexity of networks where, with our service business, we're providing a combination of 4G, fiber, we'll add 5G, as well as satellite. And so these networks are becoming very complex. And applying AI and ML to the network operations, we've already seen an impact in reduction in truck rolls, a significant impact. And so we think that this can be applied throughout our entire operations and product line. And I think that this is slightly different, but I think it's pretty exciting.
Wow, and I hadn't thought of the applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning in that area, and I it's impressive. And I think we're going to see, obviously, a lot of the other companies are already also utilizing it, but the future is going to be much different, I think, because of it. Gentlemen, this is obviously being viewed by people from around the world, but a lot of people viewing this in connection with Cabsat are from the Middle East and North Africa region. And I want to ask the same question for each of you, and I'll start with Dave. What are the characteristics that define that market, the Middle East and North Africa, and how is your company addressing the market? Dave? Sure.
There's a number of large-sized countries within the region, and I think each of these countries, or a number of these countries, have either already done some national satellites or are thinking about some national satellites. So I think that that's a key. But I think a key characteristic is that we've seen a lot of deployment of Ka-band. And I would expand the region to include Africa as well. So We've seen Yahsat with their KA capacity. And of course, Hughes is a partner with Yahsat, and we've invested with Yahsat on the YahClick business. We see good opportunity for that. And of course, Eutelsat with the Connect service is providing services throughout the Africa, Middle East area. And we think that particularly interesting is USO programs and cellular backhaul, as well as Wi-Fi as driving applications. And we also think that there's good opportunities in the government and defense sectors.
Thank you. And Imran, I wonder, are you seeing similar demands coming from the Middle East and North Africa, or are there some unique demands that you want to highlight? Imran?
I think Dave has pretty much highlighted the main drivers. So cellular backhaul is something that we are seeing, especially 4G. And it's a very interesting market because we have a very highly developed a telecom market in the Gulf, and then we have emerging markets in North Africa. But essentially, the common thread is 4G backhaul. So there's lots of 4G backhaul related demand coming out from Saudi Arabia, for instance. And then quite recently, digital inclusion projects have also taken the front seat, with Oman announcing a very big digital broadband project. Seems the case in North Africa. But from an operator's perspective, I think it's a very fragmented market. So there are global players, and there are regional players, and there are also operators who are just one satellite related to a national satellite. But in terms of our contribution, we have 5 geo satellites, the traditional wideband. Then we have a high throughput satellite, which is KA-KU, and then our O3b constellation, the MEO O3b constellation is quite active in the MENA region as well. So we have a little bit of everything for pretty much everyone.
Good. And Simon, Imran mentioned that the market is very diverse, perhaps fragmented. Does Eutelsat see it the same way? What are some of the key characteristics from Eutelsat's perspective of this market in the Middle East and North Africa? And certainly Eutelsat has long had a footprint in the region. So what's your perspective, Simon?
Yes, no, I'd agree with Imran, except that we see it in different verticals, in the sense that we're the largest Arab language satellite broadcaster in the world, so that we have a huge vertical there in broadcast. And we've also had an HTS with footprints over North Africa and the Middle East, as I said, for 9 years now. So that we see the Middle East as a very dynamic market. There's a new Connect satellite, a new Connect HTS, which is over Sub-Saharan Africa and over Europe. So that's being launched at the end of this year, beginning of next year, or rather the service is being launched at the end of this year. So we've invested a huge amount in this region. There's also, what's been interesting during COVID is that we've been asked by a number of our broadcasters to set up a broadcasting educational platform, which is something that was set up very, very quickly. And when you think about it, no country has a plan B to educate all their students at home. Doesn't exist. Plans are there for schools connectivity, but not for home connectivity, not for homeschooling. And it quickly became apparent to us, certainly as a huge broadcaster, that satellite broadcasting was a great platform to get media-rich content to everybody's houses, 5 million houses, so 20, 25 million people were allowed to actually see that kind of educational content. And that was really exciting. I mean, it was obviously, unfortunately, it was caused by COVID, but it was exciting to see governments realize the power of satellite broadcast. And then you can have recorded, you can have channels for age groups, you can have a live recording of a teacher, and then you can have thin return routes where people are texting questions and so on. So it was a very dynamic time from March onwards. I think there was something like 12 to 15 national educational platforms set up in the region. And we certainly helped with a number of those, donated, etc. And for example, now we're in discussions with the Moroccan government to set up an educational platform, etc. So that was a recent innovation that we hadn't seen coming, but it was very welcome. So yes, no, Eutelsat has always been hugely committed to MENA and will continue.
Thank you, Simon. And I guess the final word on how your company views the region and some of the ways you're addressing it. Over to Mike. And Mike, Spacebridge, I mean, is the region, does it have particular demands as you see it?
Yeah, it's actually, it's one of our premier growth markets, and it's a real focus for our company. And it's driven, as many as the other gentlemen have said, it's driven by digital inclusion, education, school connectivity, cellular backhaul. We're actually working very closely with one of the main operators in Africa for cellular backhaul. And, but also we've seen a lot of interest in infrastructure recovery. And again, military, paramilitary connectivity for emergency purposes. These are the things that people are loading onto our hub infrastructures, our TDMA networks, to deliver those type of services. So we're seeing a lot of interest in that. We're actually involved in deployments of those type of solutions as well. And so, and it continues to be our main focus in that region at this time.
Thanks, Mike. And I'm now going to, for the next couple of questions, focus on the satellites, the space segment, and then we'll turn to the ground segment. And I want to give Simon the first opportunity to comment on a real theme coming out of all the presentations so far, is that the world is hungry for bandwidth. A lot of that we saw coming as an industry, but some due to the very unfortunate, tragic pandemic, as Simon, you pointed out, has driven a lot of demand from the homes. From your perspective, how are the capabilities of the satellites? How are they matching, hopefully matching, or at least meeting this insatiable desire for bandwidth?
This is an interesting question, actually, because the Broadband Commission recently released a report where they said that they should be aiming for certainly closing the digital divide by 2025. And they also said one of their recommendations, it was a big report, so there are a number of recommendations, but one of their major recommendations is for national governments and institutions like the EU not to get locked into single silo technologies for their digital divide, for reducing digital divide. And for me, that's one of the crucial lessons we need to learn from COVID, is that we need to close the digital divide, and we need to do it within 5 to 10 years. If we're relying on just one technology, such as 5G, that would be longer than 10 years, longer than 20 years. And I think satellite is, for the first time, we're really poised to be able to supply that. We're really the only technology that would be able to physically reduce that digital divide within 5 years. And I'll give you an example. Eutelsat was involved in setting up a monitoring network in Ukraine in 2011. We were asked to do this by the EU, and in the end we were hoping to supply 12,000 polling stations across the Ukraine. So Ukraine is big, it's logistically very poor, etc. And we installed 12,000 systems in 6 weeks. Okay. We had to train 500 installers. We had to bring in 300 kilometers of cable, etc. We had to set up 3 logistics bases across Ukraine. It was 4 months of my life. But what I'm saying is no other industry can match that speed of deployment. So Ukraine is, if in European terms, is a very big country. So what other technology do you know would be able to actually close the digital divide in Europe as far as deployment goes within a matter of months? Okay, that's why I see satellite as crucial now. It's not going to be the whole story, as 5G isn't going to be the whole story, but I think we are ready now as an industry to take up 5, 10, 20% of the demand, depending on which country you're talking about. And for me, the advent of VHTS is the start of that. And I think if you remember that the satellite industry didn't really make dedicated satellites for data until 2007, something like that. And in 13 years, we've been able to reduce the cost of terminals from $5,000 to $300. For a terminal, as Dave will know, that'll do 20 megabits up and 100 megabits down for $300. You know, so we've reduced it by more than a magnitude, the cost of terminals. The cost of deployment, we now have self-installation terminals. So deployment costs zero. You don't have to have a very highly qualified engineer with an inexpensive analyzer. No. The speeds of service have gone up from, well, I don't know, we all remember the days of 128 kilobit up, and if you were lucky, half a megabit down. Well, now we're in the tens of megabits, you know, and 100 megabits down. So I think the industry is in a very good place. And I think finally politicians, and I'm not going to quote him, but Thierry Breton, which is the EU commissioner, said that he recognized that the EU should be looking at a constellation. And one of the jobs of that constellation would be to reduce the digital divide. So I think finally we might be getting our message through that we're ready. It's one of our biggest challenges as an industry, because the lobbying power of the cellular industry is huge. But I think that's one job that we're actually finally getting over. So anyway, there we go.
Thank you, Simon. And I saw a lot of heads nodding in agreement. So let me open it up to all the panelists. And if you want to speak, just raise your hand and we'll let you speak. But Simon touched on some themes, and I think Imran, you touched on it as well in digital inclusion. And that certainly the pandemic is highlighting the need for digital inclusion. And again, raise your hand if you want to speak, but how are satellites, and we'll go to Imran first, how are satellites uniquely positioned to both meet the desire for more bandwidth, more data, but also in the area of digital inclusion? So Imran, what are your thoughts?
So I would just basically like to first share with you some recent developments. So I think about 2 weeks back, the ITU took an initiative and invited various players from the industry, not just the satellite industry, but pretty much the whole telecom industry. And the ITU Secretary General wanted to get some input from all of us to prepare some recommendations for a ministerial panel, and the focus was on digital inclusion. So as Simon had pointed out, the pandemic has put a lot of focus on how to get homes connected and on remote connectivity. And the overwhelming conclusion was that satellite is one technology that can put this level of connectivity on a fast track and in a very relatively short period of time. So I'm in full agreement with what Simon had mentioned, and I would also like to point out that the industry is now in a much better shape. We are better prepared to meet the demand. And according to some estimates, by 2024, the global HTS supply is expected to exceed 24 terabits. And I'm an old timer. I remember, the small 36 megahertz bandwidth, or a satellite with only 16 transponders or 24 transponders. So we have come a really, really long way, from the narrow band, wide beam satellites to HTS, and now VHTS in both GEO as well as in the medium Earth orbit, and newer and newer constellations coming out. I mean, SES is I've already mentioned the Empower constellation. We're also doing a lot of work in the VHTS domain. SES-17 is coming out in 2021, operational in 2022, which is an all-Ka-band VHTS satellite, very much like Hughes's Jupiter satellites over the Americas.
Thanks, Imran. Dave, what's your perspective on how the industry is meeting this insatiable desire for bandwidth and addressing the needs of inclusion?
Yeah, I just want to echo what both Simon and Imran have said, and just point to some of the things that Hughes is doing. You know, we've got a VHTS going up next year, our Jupiter 3, that's going to bring 500 plus gigabits to the Americas market. So we'll have about a terabit. And to this point, we've been able to grow our HughesNet internet business to 1.5 million subscribers. And interestingly, you know, I think at our last, interestingly, a lot of the growth recently has come from the South America, from Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Mexico. And I think at our last quarterly earnings call, we announced, I think the number was over 320,000 subscribers in South America. And so that's evidence that, you know, if you think about it, that's an area where it's not as wealthy as the US. You know, it's more of a developing area. And so that's clear evidence that satellite can provide a meaningful solution in not just rich areas of the world, but developing parts of the world. And we look at Africa, Middle East as having some of the same opportunities. Perhaps the economics are more challenging, which is why cellular backhaul and community Wi-Fi and USO programs are very interesting. But again, I would echo what both Simon and Imran have said.
Thank you. Mike, anything you want to add? Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, actually, it's an incredible time. I've seen the broadband definition increase from, as Imran said, us old timers, where we were talking, the definition of broadband in the day was 128 kilobits going up to 250, 1 megabit finally. Today, I'm actually proud to be a Canadian, because over here in Canada, we developed this Canadian Universal Broadband Initiative, which is to ensure that everybody's connected. And so, you know, Canada is a very large country, and it's best serviced with only satellite. So the satellite servicing, which is supporting the North right now, is growing rapidly. There's an incredible amount of connectivity requirements, and the broadband definition has actually grown to be 10 megabits, 1 megabit for your average consumer. And by 2022, I believe that the new definition, which is expected up there, is 50 megabit, 10 megabit. So a lot of these are going to POPs, and we'll have distribution via fiber and or cellular backhaul or unlicensed LTE, for example. But a lot of it is going direct connections with high throughput satellites, et cetera, et cetera. And it goes to what Simon was mentioning about low cost terminals. Today, terminals, $300, you could put together a Ka package for $600-700, which even in the far north, you could still get decent service with. So it's a really an amazing time. And yes, the space segment has matched the terrestrial demands, and just in time. Even with the new satellites coming out, they're going to be providing bonus bandwidth. But right now, there's already a lot of bandwidth, and everybody is very satisfied with services that they're getting. So it's a good time.
Definitely a good time. And so you've all talked about the increased capability to meet this insatiable demand and the unique characteristics of satellite in that we're able to provide connectivity. But one of the long-held beliefs, and I think incorrect belief now, is around affordability. You know, is satellite capacity affordable? And I think a couple of you have talked about community Wi-Fi and other ways to crack the code that you can bring connectivity at an affordable price. We've seen the price of a satellite come down, if you will. I remember many years ago, I'm similarly an old timer, $150 million to build a geo satellite that'll sit in orbit for 14, 15 years, and all well and good, and a lot of money was made off of it. But prices for satellites have come down, launch services have come down to the end user, whether it is a consumer, an enterprise, a government. If you all could talk to how has the price equation changed, and is that increasing the opportunity, not just for inclusion, but for increased connectivity for businesses as well as government? So who wants to take the first crack in talking about affordability? Imran, go ahead.
So, I mean, the cost per bit has definitely come down. The VHTS, the cost of doing business for the satellite operators has come down tremendously, and coupled with the advancements and the more and more affordable ground segment. So we are able to compete effectively with the terrestrial alternatives. And I can give you an example in PNG, for instance. On our O3B constellation, we started out with 500 megabits back in 2013. And then for one customer, we are providing over 6 gigabits of capacity in 5 different locations. In spite of the fact that PNG has 2 undersea cables and now a viable microwave backhaul network, we are still able to compete with the terrestrial alternatives. And that's only made possible because the cost of doing business for us has come down. And as you rightly pointed out, the cost of launching the satellites, the access to space has become more and more affordable.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on the topic of affordability? Let me go to Simon and then Mike. Simon?
Sure, yes. I think the VHTS has shown us where we can get to with a price per megabit. The unfortunate thing for an HTS and VHTS is it's quite an expensive satellite. It's quite an expensive beast because you've got a mixture of terrestrial and you have quite an expensive satellite itself. So the cost of launches has come down, but compared to a wide beam standard satellite for television, it's quite expensive, you know, in the sense of you have 10 gateways. You have to have your own fiber connecting all of those gateways, for example. But the other issue for me is also the availability. Look at the quality of availability you get with a VHTS. Eutelsat is at 8 nines now for satellite availability, 8 nines to 100% across the fleet. I think we only have 2 satellites, 8 nines, the rest are at 100%. So, you know, and that's 99.999999% to 100% availability, okay? There's no other technology that offers you that. And that for me is an important point to make if you're talking about, you know, critical assets, etc., whether you're talking about fiber backhaul or you're talking about cellular backhaul. Availability is a crucial aspect. And it's one thing that I think we should definitely push more. Affordability, yes, I think will come with VHTS. We're not certain at this point, for example, on the LEO consumer broadband argument, but we believe certainly that the VHTS will be competitive. But again, it's also a question of competitive in which market, in the sense of in the US, people are prepared to pay $70, $80, $100 for their connectivity. In Europe, because of France Telecom, Deutsche Telekom, or British Telecom, we're only paying around $30 to $40 or $50 for our connectivity. So it depends on the continent or the market you're talking about as to whether it's, you know, very affordable.
Thanks, Simon. So Mike, what's your perspective on the topic of affordability?
Affordability is the affordability of satellite bandwidth, and I just want to compliment the ground equipment, because of course the satellite bandwidth is there, but the ground equipment is how it delivers it efficiently, of course. And so I always look at what are the the changes in society, okay, that have come about as a result of this. I always look at the success of LTE over satellite, for example, as a convergence of technologies at the right time. There was HTS satellite that came out, high performance ground equipment, and a satellite friendly protocol, LTE, and they came across at this right time to create an affordable deployment package, which has really changed the cellular backhaul completely, and has changed the lives of millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people, I would say. Now, going forward, okay, what will be the affordable solution that'll drive the 5G business case? Okay, that's the real question. I've always thought that 5G is also coming at a time of convergence, okay, of new technologies, VHTS being one and LEO being another. So, but at the end, it's always the investment cost, and it's always a relation to the affordability of the bandwidth. So it's going to be a very exciting going forward into the next couple of months, into the next year or so, to see how these services pan out, especially with 5G rollouts.
Thanks. Dave, on affordability, you mentioned community Wi-Fi, which I think is a great solution for people who don't have economic means. But what's your perspective?
Well, I just want to back up to the bigger picture, in terms of, we've seen a clear trend in reduced cost per megabit per month. I think it was Euroconsult I was looking at that, they reckon the price, particularly with HTS, is going south at $200 a megabit per month, and over the next several years, it's going to continue to go well south. And one of the key drivers is, of course, HTS and very large scale HTS. But I think one of the really exciting things is the flexible satellites that the satellite manufacturers are talking about. These flexible satellites have some interesting promise. They're standard satellites, so they'll cost less. You won't have to pay a bunch of NRE to the satellite manufacturer. There's the ability to grow the gateway infrastructure over time. You could start service in every beam with maybe two gateways and scale the investment over time. And so there's a potential for a lower overall CapEx, a potential for a scaled investment over time. And I think what the satellite manufacturers have been saying is that they think that they can achieve costs that are approaching the kind of costs that you see in a VHTS in terms of cost per gigabit or cost per bit. So I think that there's a lot of the industry's had great trend of reducing prices over time, and I think the industry can continue that trend.
Great. And a number of you have mentioned the role of the ground segment in reducing those costs. And I'd like to shift the focus now to the ground segment in the roughly 20 minutes remaining. What do each of you see as the game changer on the ground segment, the infrastructure? Is it at the teleport? Is it at the antenna? Comment on, the long promised flat panel antenna and mobility. There's a whole lot of activity on the ground segment. And I think, as a number of you pointed out, it has and will continue to revolutionize both the throughput of satellites as well as the affordability. So let me start with Mike and ask Mike, from your perspective, what are some of the key developments on the ground side that you see as really changing the story for satellite? Mike, you're on mute. There you
on
go.
the ground side, that is a very interesting question, and it's a challenging question because it's so encompassing of so many different things. Okay, Dave mentioned as well that Dave and I have both spoken about cloud. We've both spoken about the way things are moving around and the infrastructure is changing. That in itself is a challenge. But a lot of the thing is, I understand that there's so much conversation with regards to flat panel antennas and steerable antennas. And I think that that is going to be also a very important thing. You could tell right away that it has a large impact on LEO and MEO offerings, which are large bandwidth offerings. And so I think that in the sense of that, it's probably has its largest impact. I would say that, like, I've always thought about the mobility market as being the driver for flat panel steerable antennas. But as I go forward, I think that the introduction of that type of technology will pretty much change everything in a LEO scope of things, because it won't only be a mobility solution, it'll also be a fixed terrestrial solution. So you'll need those type of antennas everywhere for LEO, and it'll be even if you're providing an extra bandwidth boost to a 5G Earth station, or if you're providing connectivity to a remote school. That's an interesting technology that'll impact everything, and it'll impact everywhere. So I think that that's probably the biggest, most interesting thing that's going on at a purely technological level at this time.
Thanks. And I mentioned earlier how Hughes has nicely straddled both the space and the ground segments. So I want to ask Dave for his perspective on what are some of the pivotal, game changers coming on the ground side of the equation.
I don't know that I'd say game changers. I'd say we're continuing our trajectory of just continually reducing the cost, CapEx and OpEx. That's what I think all of us have been trying to do, year in and year out. And that's why we invest so much into our own system on a chip that powers our terminals. We've got a new system on a chip coming out next year, and it's going to power a new family of terminals. And it's all about increasing performance while also being able to reduce the cost. And we're doing similar things with gateways. In the US with our VHTS, we're implementing Q-band and V-band feeder beams for our gateways, and that's driving us to do a number of interesting things with the architecture in terms of centralized processing and being able to switch over these gateways very, very quickly, and that's driving us to integrate with a SDN, a software-defined network, and as Mike had pointed out, we're incorporating a lot of virtualization into our networks. And again, this is all about cost and performance, which goes back to the prior topic. So we're just continuing that trajectory.
Thanks. And Simon, you mentioned how the cost has come down, I think several $100s, and you don't need expensive testing equipment, and in some cases the end user can install their terminal. And I know Mr. Musk with SpaceX has talked about having a terminal that you only need to plug and point. Simon, you very much, I know you personally have your feet on the ground as well as in space. So what's your perspective on developments in the ground segment?
Yes, no, I'm an antenna guy. I was in the antenna approval team at Eutelsat for 6 years. So I've alone tested something like 60 antennas, been in range tests. So yes, I mean, as an antenna guy, what has all of our past and all of our future customers ever used? They've only used one thing. They've all used an antenna. They will all use an antenna. So I find it funny that antennas are suddenly being focused on when they've always been important. They've always been crucial. I'm very much looking forward to the idea of a flat panel. The OneWeb recently said that if they paid, I think, $100 million a year, they would be able to get $1,000 flat panel antenna. So at that kind of money, you know, but nobody knows what this flat panel antenna's performance will be. Nobody knows what its power will be, whether it will cause interference, etc. So this is in the future, and I think the CEO of SatExpo spelled it out. He said that if you're looking for a consumer flat panel antenna, it's not for many years. It's not for in the future, and consumer prices are about $300. You know. He doesn't see a broadband flat panel antenna for many years, and I don't think I see one until the mid 20s at this point. Even if the mid to late 20s. So I think we will carry on on the consumer point with parabolic antennas, because they are very efficient and they're very cheap to produce and they're very easy to install. So I think from the mid 20s, 25 onwards, then we might start to see some interesting flat panel antennas for LEO, because for me that's the holy grail. If we can get a consumer grade antenna that will give broadband performance without causing interference, with a LEO fleet, at that point it'll become very interesting. But whether we get to that point, I don't know. So that would be my answer with ground. So I'm very happy with the parabolic antenna. It's done me proud up to this point.
Okay, thanks. Imran, any thoughts on the topic?
So from my point of view, the key word is becoming mainstream. So we've already identified that satellites now can become or can support terabits of capacity, and this is going to grow over the years. So what's preventing us from becoming mainstream? So I believe it's the antennas. And I agree wholeheartedly with Simon that once the antenna riddle is solved, that's when we will be able to put a satellite terminal on every 5G node, for instance. Every E node B can have a satellite terminal. At the moment, I mean, the parabolic antennas, they're very efficient. But yet they require a lot of space, and especially when you are tracking. In case of our MEO satellites, we do have tracking antennas. So for us, the holy grail is definitely electronically steered flat panel antennas. So we are doing things in stages. The stage one, especially for our O3b constellation, is the development of new terminals, which are much more cost effective. And then leading up to, because we have already put in some investment in flat panel antennas, 2025 onwards is where we see a flat panel antenna, which is number one, has a good form factor. Number two, it does not consume that much power. And most importantly, has to be as efficient as a parabolic antenna, or come close to the efficiency in order for it to be able to fulfill the promise. But in summary, we're not going to get mainstream. We're not going to be able to put in millions of terminals unless the antennas become, very easy to deploy. And terminals without cables. I think Mike was talking about that as well.
I like that, terminals without cables. Look forward to that day. We've talked off and on during the last 55 minutes or so about the LEOs, and certainly Imran, and I'll start with you, Imran. SES has a very robust and soon to be even more powerful MEO system. I'd like each of you to talk about how you see the roles of LEO, MEO, and GEO. Are they complementary? Are they competitive? Most of the LEO systems are saying we're not going to go after consumer, at least initially, but some are saying consumer. That plays into certainly the antenna discussion that we just had. So the question for each of you is, how do you view the emerging NGSO, non-geostationary orbiting networks? How do you view that? And of course, we have the MEO system and then GEOs. So let me start with Imran, and it's a very open-ended question, but what's the relationship, as you see it, between LEO, MEO, GEO? Are they competitive? Are they complementary? What's your perspective, Imran?
So obviously, we are very, very bullish on MEO. We already have one system in operation since 2014. It's doing very, very well commercially. And then we have announced the 11th satellite constellation, our O3b mPOWER, which which will support more than one terabits of capacity. So we feel that the middle mile, which is low latency and high throughput, is definitely where MEO has a sweet spot. So having personally been involved in the O3b story from very early stages, I can tell you that new constellation have a way of expanding the market. So we feel that it's going to be complementary. That they're definitely not going to be competing I mean, there's definitely going to be some churn, but not significant. But the business cases of the MEO constellation is something that we should definitely pay attention to, because fundamentally these constellations do require a lot of replacements in terms of the satellites and the maintenance of the ground infrastructure. But essentially, this will broaden the pie. And again, my theme for today is going mainstream. So this will help us go mainstream.
Thanks, Imran. And I next want to get Simon's perspective. Do you similarly see it as largely complementary, LEO, GEO, MEO? What's your view, Simon?
Yes, no, totally complementary at this point. For us, the LEO, certainly a low orbit, a LEO that has a very small RF budget for the antennas, etc. That is a sweet spot that we see for LEO. And we're launching a small fleet of nanosatellites this year and next year for that particular purpose. We haven't seen, because of a number of issues, including the antenna price, a broadband flat panel antenna price, we haven't seen a good argument for a low orbit, very dense fleet of multiple thousands of LEOs for consumer. We haven't seen that. We have seen some arguments for public-private partnership with LEOs and GEOs, GEO operators. That for us would be certainly a way forward. And it's not surprising to us the UK government's just bought OneWeb. The EU commissioner has made it plain that he thinks that LEOs would be part of the solution. So at the moment, totally complementary, certainly between LEO and GEO for us, that's our point of view. But yes, for me, it's a fascinating time for the satellite industry. This is fascinating that we're on the next step is another whole orbit and another whole list of applications for that orbit. You know, I'm really excited by the advent of LEO fleets. The one thing I would add is that we've been operating spacecraft for over 40 years. Making sure that space exploration and space exploitation is still possible is a huge responsibility. And we at Eutelsat, and I'm sure everybody at this meeting, at this panel, takes that responsibility very seriously. And there's a quote from a British admiral that I always remember. It takes a few years to build a ship. It takes centuries to build tradition. And it takes decades to build excellence in spacecraft operation. And I do hope that the new entrants into the LEO market understand their responsibility. You know, and that is one aspect that does worry me about the large, dense LEO fleets at this point.
Okay, well, thank you, Simon. And Dave Hughes is an investor in OneWeb. Certainly, you know, plays in both LEO and GEO and perhaps MEO as well. What's your perspective, Dave, on whether we're talking about complementary systems or are they competitive?
Well, once again, I find myself echoing Simon and Imran. But yeah, we view it as complementary. And now, in terms of, by the way, of the reorganized OneWeb, we haven't made the investment yet. I think that's pending. But yeah, we're planning to make an investment in OneWeb, and that underscores our view that that NGSO and GEO are complementary. And just to develop the point further, with GEO, we can get our view, we can get the lowest possible cost per bit, and we can get the capacity density that's needed to serve the markets that we're addressing. And we can also get the lowest cost terminal because we can get for fixed GEO applications, a traditional parabolic antenna is perfect. It's fantastic. It is, as Simon said, it's pretty efficient and it's really low cost. And so that's a really good combination, while NGSO give coverage and that has some really interesting applications, mobility among them. I think what SES is doing with the mPOWER, the MEO, I think that's extremely exciting because that orbit brings some particular advantages. And what SES is talking about with the mPOWER, I think those are really, I think Imran called it middle market or something like that. I think that's a really interesting service area. So we see lots of opportunities. We think that they're all complementary.
Great. So Mike, you agree they are complementary, and are you as excited as everyone is?
I agree. In the long run, everything will be complementary, but I think that I think that there's a lot of people, a lot of organizations that are hoping that LEO will provide them something, perhaps seamless networking that they feel that they're perhaps not having at this time. I think Imran made the point about what he referred to. I think I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was about we have to become one with their networks. We have to be common networking. I think that you see large mobile operators such as our Airtel that are investing in OneWeb. And I think that, you have to consider what their longer range plans are. I think there's going to be a bleed over of capacity from traditional GEO or even HTS toward LEO. Or at least there's going to be a lot of plans to do such things at the beginning. I think it's one thing to look at is how did HTS affect standard GEO, and it was basically a huge impact on the space. And of course now everything's stabilized, everybody's comfortable. So it's the same thing when the O3B came out. It was a big threat to GEO, and now it's everybody's comfortable with the complementary relationships. I think LEO is going to be the same thing. I think LEO is going to grab a lot of headlines. I think you have some very ambitious people in that space with Elon Musk and Amazon, both pushing those solutions. And I think that they're going to try to take lion shares of bandwidth away from the traditional operators. But as Simon says, they have a history of providing those type of solutions, and you can't just dismiss that by guys that come in with a fast sales pitch. So I think that in the long run, everything will be complementary, and all that bandwidth will be consumed without any hesitation by consumers. So,
okay. Yeah, Simon, go ahead.
Yeah, there was one statistic. I recently started an ESA study on next generation satellites, and I was in charge of use cases, that work package anyway. And one statistic that really struck me is that bandwidth demand goes up by about 40% a year. So, we're going to always be slightly behind the curve, unfortunately, because the curve is so steep. And I think LEOs will bring us a huge amount of extra bandwidth that will satisfy that extra demand. So I'm not worried about the huge competition are worried about being able to satisfy the demand.
Thank you, Simon. I see a lot of heads nodding in agreement. It seems to be the view of the panel, very strong view of the panel, that very much in the medium to long term complementary, perhaps to Mike's point, a little choppiness in the beginning as LEO systems emerge, but very much yet another means to meet the demands for affordable connectivity. We're basically at the top of the hour, and I think we've indulged your time a lot. I appreciate that. And to Dave, Simon, Imran, and Mike, on behalf of the organizers of Cabsat and certainly GVF, I want to thank you all. It's been a really excellent, stimulating discussion. Very much appreciated, and wish you all good health and good fortune. Thank you.